And then the third thing is the sex thing. The Air Force had a specific policy against homosexuality.
Throw people out of planes if you must.
Yeah, but no blowjobs in your office.
History, I'd like to follow me down the rabbit hole. History, I'd like to, frankly, I want to know.
Hello, and welcome to HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck, where history is a party and everybody's coming. I am your host, Dawn Brody, and today we have the wild, true story of Donald Nichols. He is a 7th grade dropout who rises from Army mechanic to Black Ops phenomenon during the Korean War. Okay, hear about how he becomes this incredible, Apocalypse Now-esque spy master with his own covert army, no accountability, heads in buckets. It's crazy shit. And girl, the only thing that is more insane than his unlikely rise to power is the batshit descent. Find out why the government ultimately drags him out in a straitjacket and subjects him to weeks of electroshock therapy. Right? Now, my guest is historian and author Blaine Harden, who wrote the book King of Spies, The Dark Reign of America's Spy Master in Korea. And he also wrote the book that I used as my primary source for a previous episode, the one about the North Korean defector who stole the fighter jet. And girl, he is the real deal. Okay, boots on the ground, spent years in dusty old archives pushing to have stuff declassified and then sifting through the mountain of what was declassified. I mean, Blaine Harden is more than just an expert, okay? He is the leading expert on this guy. I'm so stoked. I'm totally starstruck. I hope you'll agree that I mostly kept it together. Blaine Harden joined me from his office in Seattle. Let's get started. I'm really, really grateful that you have joined me and the HILF listeners for this batshit HILF Donald Nichols.
Delighted to be here.
I wanted to start with introducing folks to how we met, because it was kind of a wonder of social media. I had done, for those of you who listened to all the episodes, I had done episode 75 back in January on the how to steal a fighter jet. And it was the story of No Kum-suk, the North Korean defector. And when it was out, the episode came out, a friend tagged you in a post of mine and said, Blaine, is this you? Is this your book? And you were like, yeah. And then you listened to the podcast and you reached out and you were like, Dawn, if you think that was a batshit story, wait till you hear this one. And it filled my sails. I was still excited about it.
And the reason I contacted you was because I thought the episode was very good, but it was also very accurate and sophisticated historically. And so I thought, this gal is doing good stuff. And so I wanted to tell her about Donald Nichols.
Oh, God, I can't tell you how tight my toes are curled up in my shoes right now, because I think ultimately I'm always just a student, really? The teacher said I did good? Right. So I'm grateful for that. And we're really lucky, too, because you honed in, you were specifically, Dawn, when No Kum-suk lands on the American air base, this guy that we're going to talk about, Donald Nichols, was he the first one to interview No Kum-suk on that day? Yes,
he had his own intelligence base not far from the air base where the fighter pilot landed. And Nichols got in his own helicopter. He had his own helicopter and flew immediately over and barged into the office of the commanding colonel and said, I'll take over now. And so he took the fighter pilot in his helicopter back to his base and debriefed him for about 2 days and did a brilliant job and wrote up a debrief that was classified for about 50 years until I got it. And it really did sum up with incredible precision and accuracy the life and times of the fighter pilot who escaped. And so I spent many weeks with that fighter pilot for the previous book. And I said, well, who was Donald Nichols? And he sort of didn't know. And then I read and found out that no one really knew who he was, what he did, or what happened to him. And then I got his military service record, talked to his family, and then I finally found people who served with him. And his story was completely unknown in its most sordid details to history.
It is so interesting and such an incredible read. And this is the kind of thing that, like, you couldn't Google. Like when I went to Don Nichols's Wikipedia page, you are the primary source. Like, there's you and like another, I think one other author that kind of had his own biography, because Donald Nichols wrote a bullshit autobiography that you also have to sift through what he writes is true and what he writes is a lie, and how can you compare it? I mean, the work that went into this in and of itself is a HILF, in my opinion.
Well, it did take a lot of work, but I was very prepared for it, having done 2 previous books on North Korea. And the reason I wanted to do this book was to look at American policy towards the creation of a divided Korean peninsula. And Nichols was a great personality to give that story life.
At one point when we were talking, just kind of trying to arrange the best time and stuff to have this interview, you said, I had to go back and read my book and like refamiliarize myself with this because it's been a few years. And you said, and he haunted my dreams for a long time. And it's kind of a rough hang to suddenly have this guy back in my frontal lobe.
Well, it's true. The reason he haunted my dreams is because he's such a contradictory character. He was a hero. He genuinely helped save American lives, many thousands of lives. But he was also a sexual criminal, sexual predator, and a thief, and a murderer. He threw people out of planes that he didn't like. And he was not supervised. And so as I didn't understand the dark dimensions of his story when I started working on it, and then I kept finding stuff and hearing stuff, and it just freaked me out. As I was doing the reporting was so fun. It was like a detective story where around every corner is a darker secret.
Yeah. Oh, and we are going to have so much fun, Blaine, because it was one of those where sometimes I was listening. I often, when I do my research, I have the physical book and then I also have the audiobook. So depending on how like my day is, going, I'm either going to be reading it or listening to it. And the quantity of times that my household heard me do oh my God, while I was taking in this story, it has to be like a tally mark on the wall to just be like, that had to be the most. That might have been the most, and it just keeps going and go. And you think you've gotten to the end of his story, and then you're like, holy shit, then he's in the downfall and the shocking demise of this fella. Are you ready to go, Blaine?
I'm ready to go.
I'm starting with a story, as I like to do, and this one has you and I and our listeners are all recruits for Donald Nichols, currently working on these islands off the coast of South Korea, and we are so totally under his command. This guy is so completely in control of everything we do that the entire unit we're in is called Nick. It's just synonymous with him himself, right? And tonight, on this particular evening, we're in this little boat and we're crossing from one of these islands onto the mainland of South Korea, and where we do all of our spookiest spy shit. And Nick himself is on board with us, which is bad shit. Because this guy, he's legendary. There's a lot we don't know about him, but some stuff we do, like he's tall as fuck. He doesn't appear to report to anybody. There have occasionally been times we may have seen somebody come in and try to give him an order, but he fucking blew it off and nothing happened to him. He's seen a lot of people die. He's killed a lot of people. He's sent a lot of people to certain death. He has money. He throws fistfuls of money around. Very weird dude. And we are in this boat. He's with it, and we're just scuttling across a dark-ass river on this dark-ass night in the middle of a dark-ass war, okay? And then all of a sudden, light. Blinding light coming in from all these windows. We're in the middle of a spotlight, bad news, and we hear voices yelling commands at us, and fuck, worst case scenario. It's the North Koreans. And they're yelling, fuck, and you're all going to die. And we look at what we can see out the window. Sure as shit, it's one of their biggest, scariest boats. And they got the Soviet flags and the Soviet cannons aimed at us. And they board with their uniforms. And they grab Nick. They grab the boss. They take him and they say, we're going to fucking kill this American dog traitor. And then we're going to take each one of you. And we're going to nail your shit to the... And we're just, oh, fuck. This is it. And then all of a sudden... one of our friends jumps to his feet and yells, no, 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 not me. I'm with you. I am a North Korean spy. And Blaine, if I was making the movie, if this one was mine, right, I would have it all get very eerily still in that moment, right? And that sweeping light around the inside of the boat. And Don Nichols would turn and just slowly smile as his captors let him go. And I don't know if that's how it went, right? But what did happen, according to your sources, is that he created this entire scenario and did successfully catch his mole that night.
Yeah. One of the people who worked with Nichols told that story, and it was probably Nichols' most theatrical way of catching the moles who found their way into his unit.
It absolutely kill. I mean, you just think about the resources and the planning it took for him to be able to pull that off. Where did he get the boat? Where did he get all these uniforms? You know what I mean? How? And according to your book, he did that. He planned that entirely on his own.
Well, he did everything on his own. The thing was that the moles inside his unit had reported with real specificity and accuracy about the things that he was doing. And then after the Korean War, there was a trial in Pyongyang in North Korea that very accurately described what Nichols had been up to, in part because there were moles in his unit. He caught at least one of them, but there were probably others that he didn't catch. And he did have killed other people who came to his base to try to shoot him. So he lived in an incredibly violent world, and the violence wasn't just his own. North Korea was indeed trying to kill him.
Yeah, it's not paranoia if they're actually out to get you, right?
That's right. The paranoia sort of leaked into his post-war life. As we'll hear later.
Yeah, but not too much of a shock. When you're in the middle of war, it's not paranoia, it's preparedness.
Yeah.
It's, right, good intelligence, yeah. Well, and if him, seeking out that mole, that moment is sort of part of his peak of power, part of where he had unlimited resources and he's doing everything entirely on his own. What I want to do with you is go back then to the beginning, the origin, of how he gets there. So when we talk about his beginnings, my question for you, Blaine, is do you think we should start with his nymphomaniac mom or when he was a mobile embalmer during World War II?
I think we should start with his mom.
Okay.
So he was born in Hackensack, the youngest of 4 brothers. His father was a postman and his mother was sort of a tramp. She bathed naked in the kitchen sink. She slept with men other than her husband on the sofa while her sons were playing on the living room rug, and her husband was out delivering the mail. And then,
which is for not a conventional
No. And so he was the youngest of these 4 brothers, and he saw this, grew up with it. And then his mother went off with somebody, and the father took his sons down to South Florida, sort of limped down there, broke and hopeless, and very much still in love with the woman who had betrayed him so many times. And Nichols grew up down there, just poor as a mouse. He had he had hand-me-down jeans that had holes in the butt. He went to school. He resented people because he knew that they looked down on him for being poor. And the way the family pulled things together was that Nichols became a thief. He stole everything from tomatoes to tractor parts from people in the neighborhood where they lived. And they were really desperately poor and often hungry.
Yeah, and from what you said too, it was like Dad was pathetic. It was like I was sort of prepared because he was so violent. And as soon as you get to the childhood part, I was like, here we go.
Yeah.
Who fucked this kid up? You know what I mean? How did he get so damaged? And you're like, well, his mom was a slut and ran off. And I was like, okay, check. And then I was waiting for violent dad. And it was a surprise. His dad was sort of he would say, your mom was so good, and like she'll come back to us, or you, implying to them, like, you kids write her a letter and you tell her how much you love her, and then maybe she'll come back to us. And I thought that was such a nuanced form of sort of childhood trauma.
The father did that, particularly with Donald, his youngest, asking Donald to write letters to beg her to come back. But the father, in between being sort of a pathetic pleader, was also angry. And he threatened to cut his throat in front of the boys, but only after he'd cut all of their throats. So there was menace mixed with the pathetic qualities of the father. In any case, Nichols left his father at the age of 17 to enlist in the U.S. Army in 1940. He did it mostly so he could eat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was a lot of folks who found themselves still enlisting for reasons that are purely economic, because this is better than an abusive or being unhoused or whatever their scenario may be.
Right.
And the job that he gets kind of reflects that he has no connections and he's very young, and he. Can you tell us a little bit about what it was that he did in the motor pool during World War II? What that meant? So
he enlisted in 1940, and World War II came along, and he was sent to Pakistan, to Karachi, not yet Pakistan, and there he worked in a motor pool. He was a carburetor repairman, and he was competent at that job, but at some point in his time in Karachi, he became a kind of Radar O'Reilly kind of figure, going out and solving problems, getting things, forging paperwork, and getting for his machine crew, lots of the things that food, parts, just made everybody's life better. He did it illegally. He stole, he forged papers, and his bosses never questioned his techniques. Only his they only welcomed the delivery of all this stuff. And so Nichols learned the key lesson, actually, the one that he applied so brilliantly in Korea, was that it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you do it.
Yeah, and it sounds like such a reflection of how things went in his home too. I mean, if he was feeding his brothers and his dad by stealing vegetables, and now he's feeding his unit, I mean, it seems like a really obvious and natural transition of skills.
Yeah, there's a certain consistency in what he did. And he was also sort of creative. During that time, lots of his colleagues were getting sick from dysentery and other things that they didn't have good drugs for. And he realized that the Army had not made enough provision for embalming all the people who got sick and died in his base. And so he went into the embalming business just to sort of supplement his income. Yeah,
so like really gruesome work that he also took to with a certain, like, other things. Like there's this like an accumulation of things that you see Don Nichols is willing to do that nobody else is willing to do. And then even among the willing, he excels. It seems to be sort of the lock key to his success.
So this guy had a 7th grade education, but he had a good ear for languages, and he had an even better sense of what he could get away with and how it would please upper level brass. And that's what he ran with.
And bring him even more.
That's right.
Yeah. And it also explains really after the war, because, for a lot of us, you look at World War II and we forget that the vast majority of American GIs are citizen soldiers who were drafted or enlisted, but have no career in the military. This is not their goal. They can't wait to come home and do something else. So the Depression's over and they get the GI Bill, or maybe and the economy's kind of booming. They're like, this is great. Unless you're a figure like Donald Nichols, in which you just have to go back to your shitty fucking poor, motherless, sad father. And so the quantity of like good jobs changed what defined a good job. And this is part of the reason your book explains why Don Nichols was sort of an easy recruit to this place, Korea, that was like, nobody wants to go there, man. The war's over. Everybody wants to go home, right?
So when the war was over, he flew back to the United States and got treated for dysentery and other stuff and got better, and then re-enlisted. But there weren't all that many opportunities, so he went back into a motor pool, this time in Guam, in the Far East. And while he was there, recruiters from the Army Counterintelligence Corps, which is a kind of spy outfit for risks around Army bases, came sniffing around looking for recruits. He volunteered and was chosen and was sent to Japan for 6 weeks of training. 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Now,
6 weeks.
6 weeks that's as close as he ever came to higher education. Was 6 weeks of that training. He did well in the training.
He hardly learned to crochet in 6 weeks.
That's right.
You know.
And then he was sent to Korea. Now we should explain what Korea was at that point. So Douglas MacArthur is at that point rebuilding post-war Japan and doing a great job of it. MacArthur was very, very proud of himself. As much he suffered from peacockery in that he thought he was great and he didn't want to learn anything he didn't already know at that stage of his career. And so MacArthur was not very interested in Korea, and no one really was. It was considered to be the last place that a skilled officer would want to be sent. It was said that there are 3 things that a GI in Japan should avoid, which is gonorrhea, diarrhea, and Korea. But Nichols was sent there, and he embraced it like he embraced everything in his military service. And he arrived in 1946, and a civil war was breaking out. A civil war that the United States public never paid much attention to, but that was really at the heart of the division of the Koreas.
And can you tell us about the arbitrary bullshit reason that the Korean Peninsula is divided on the 38th parallel? Because Blaine mentioned there's a civil war in Korea, and it's because it's split in half. And there's a really kind of clear line. It makes me nuts.
Well, it's important to realize that Korea had been ruled in a very cruel imperialist way by Japan for almost all of the 20th century. Koreans in the North and in the South, there was no North and the South until the United States divided it, a couple colonels with a National Geographic map, as World War II was ending, just drew this arbitrary line across the peninsula.
It's also in my movie, by the way. I have that scene. It's about cigarettes. It's a scene about cigarettes and magazines and like Miller Lite, and they just are like there's a line. It looks about halvesies,
right?
And I couldn't. And the Russians say okay. The fact that the Russians looked at this map and were like, this was
really the first and most important part of the beginning of the Cold War, the drawing of that line. Stalin accepted it and moved in with lots and lots of Soviet officers and trainers and developed a puppet, Kim Il-sung, who went on to become the great leader and the founder of the dynasty that still rules North Korea. And in the South, the Americans reluctant colonial powers in South Korea because they knew nothing about it. There was no money there. But they came in, and they came in a very confused way. What was happening is after the Japanese were defeated and were forced to leave Korea, there was chaos up and down the peninsula. The working farmers, the people who had no land and no money, they wanted a redistribution of wealth. A sort of communist redistribution. They thought that would be the most fair and the best way to start again. And in the North, Kim Il-sung sort of did that. All the landowners, all the people who collaborated with the Japanese were either killed or forced to leave. Most of them just left voluntarily, and they went to the South.
Yeah, and he's also like broadening literacy and increasing distribution of goods. I mean, like life for your average North Korean got noticeably and immediately better under
The
Kim.
CIA said that immediately as they were monitoring what was going on, is that the Soviets and Kim Il-sung's regime are doing a pretty good job, and there's real grassroots support for this system. In the South, it was a completely different story. The Americans decided to put their money on Syngman Rhee, who was the best educated Korean in the history of the world at that time. He had a master's degree from Harvard and a PhD from Princeton. Spent most of his life walking around the halls of Congress in the United States, while outside of the peninsula. The Americans brought him back because he was respected, because he was so well educated, and because they thought they would be able to use him as a puppet leader. But Syngman Rhee was a really, really difficult customer, and he pretended to go along with the Americans, and he got elected as president of South Korea. And once he was elected, he became very hard for the Americans to manipulate or deal with. He wanted to go to war with the North, and the North wanted to go to the war with the South. And the Americans and the Soviet Union, later the Russians, they weren't so keen on a war, but the conflict was their puppets kept pushing it. And that's the context that Donald Nichols came into. And the other thing that's really important is that when Nichols came into the Korean Peninsula in 1946, the peasants, the people who had been abused and impoverished by the Japanese, they wanted land reform. They wanted a government that served their needs. But that's not what the Americans and Syngman Rhee were offering them. They were offering them a sort of top-down capitalist system that reinforced inequality. And so the people who were unhappy, they went to war against the capitalists at the top.
And this is before the Korean War. So there's this like period of time, there's like these 3 years between the end of World War II and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the forming of the UN, which is like 1945 to about 1949. And that was sort of when the Soviets, the puppets, as you said, the Soviets, Russia and the United States are pretending, and China, like we are still the, comrades in arms that just won World War II together. And we know that we're drawing these lines and we're all assembling tanks and we're not great, but we actually don't want to go to war, but we do know this is already a pissing contest. And if everyone's bringing their dicks out in Korea, we got to show up with our dick out. And right. And our dick is a capitalist right wing murdering his competitor's dick in South Korea. And the North Korean that the Soviets, I mean, one of the things I was kind of blown away by was that the Soviets tried really hard to make it appear that he wasn't their puppet. Whereas the United States seemed to come in like, look, he dresses like an American. He speaks like an American. He went to American schools. You guys love that, right? And the South Koreans were like, like we weren't asking. We weren't asking for that. Whereas the North Koreans, the Russians had, whether you call it good sense or manipulation, to be like, he's the revolutionary of the people, by the people. He was fighting the Japanese even before he was fighting, like, this is your guy. And they would paint themselves out of portraits and things like that, just to make it clear to the North Koreans that he's one of you.
Right. And Kim Il-sung had some legitimate credentials as an anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter. He was fairly successful at that. And he was well known. His name was on the lips of all Koreans, knew who he was and what he had done to fight against the Japanese. But Syngman Rhee was also well known as an anti-Japanese crusader who'd been imprisoned by the Japanese and who had fled the country. But both were incredibly strong personalities who very quickly asserted they wanted to control the entire peninsula individually with the guns and money of their patron, either the Soviet Union or the United States.
And this is such a perfect introduction then to how our guy, Don Nichols, climbs right in bed with Syngman Rhee.
Right.
And when I say climb in bed, girl, like, you never imply it in your book that these two might have been possibly slight, but their relationship is definitely weird. It is certainly intimate in the sense that they call each other father and son.
Right.
So the intimate, familial, more than just business, more than just military, more than just comrades in arms. There's something very special about their relationship. They both get, I'm sure there's probably a psychiatrist who would talk about daddy issues with our guy, Don Nichols, but Syngman Rhee also desperately needed to have his string, if he knows that this isn't the puppet, this is the strongest string that connects him to his puppet masters, right? Can you tell us a little bit more about how they made the acquaintance and the extent to which this relationship starts to make you just squint your eyes as you're reading and be like, what is this?
Right. So this is the autumn of 1946. The Civil War between the people who want to overthrow Syngman Rhee and American power is raging. People are getting killed by the hundreds in cities all over South Korea. Nichols comes in as an army intelligence guy and immediately sides with Syngman Rhee's people. And then he meets Syngman Rhee sometime in the late summer, early fall of 1946. And they find value in each other, even though they're the most, they couldn't be more different. Donald Nichols is 6'2", weighs somewhere between 180 and 280 pounds, depending on how much chocolate and Coke he'd been drinking. And Syngman Rhee is this bony, old, 71-year-old guy with a PhD from Princeton who is trying to figure out how to get American guns and money, but do what he wants and fight a war against the North. And what Syngman Rhee saw in Nichols was a conduit to the generals in Japan who could deliver money and arms. And what Nichols saw in Syngman Rhee, who was by that time the head of state, was the best possible source an intelligence person could have, particularly an intelligence person who's 23 years old with a 7th grade education.
Right.
And they found favor in each other's eyes, and they developed a relationship that continued for 11 years, which is, in American intelligence operatives never spend 11 years in a place like Korea. It's just unheard of. And Nichols was building up this relationship for 4 years before the war started. The war started in 1950 with the North invading the South. But during that time, Nichols developed his friendship with Syngman Rhee and with all of the intelligence operatives who operated under Syngman Rhee, who were a bunch of murdering thugs.
Well, and the U.S. interest is because even if they didn't believe that the Civil War was necessarily going to happen, Syngman Rhee was fighting against the people who just wanted to topple American power. So they're just dealing with their own interests at first, which is, we can't let the South Korean people dismantle this person that we've put in place. And so it made sense that they were giving unlimited, resources to him and then to Don Nichols, who if I'm right, I mean, there were a number of atrocities. He's watching mass executions, Syngman rounding up his opposition, and with such easy labels as, like, sometimes he'd say they're communist, but like Syngman Rhee would kill hundreds, thousands of men, women, and children because they were communist sympathizers.
Or believed to be.
They didn't hate, right. It didn't appear to us they hated communism enough.
Right.
That was reason, enough to be rounded up and summarily executed.
Those mass executions in the big numbers did not begin until the war started. And Syngman Rhee used the war as an excuse to sort of ramp up what had been sort of a lower level of abuse and small scale killings. But in any case, Nichols was aware of all of this at the time. And another bit of really important context before the war started is that both the United States and the Soviet Union, after the line was drawn across the Korean Peninsula, they both sent in tens of thousands of military troops on both sides. But Harry Truman, after the war, was very, very interested in saving money. And so he pulled out virtually all the troops from South Korea. That didn't happen in the North. The Soviet Union pulled out most of its ground troops, but it kept in thousands of advisors and lots of heavy armament, fighter planes, tanks, artillery, and lots of planners for using them. And so the Americans sort of unilaterally undressed themselves militarily.
Which is not as wonderful as it sounds.
Right.
Hey, before we get back into the heart of darkness here, a moment to thank those who have infiltrated my inner sanctum, my patrons. The latest to jump in bed with the pod include Kathleen M. and Cooper W. Support like theirs has helped HILF go live. I've just launched a new monthly live show called HILF Public School, which is happening at Flappers Comedy Club in Burbank, California. It's the first Thursday of the month, and I am your host and history teacher, and I've packed the teacher's lounge with class clowns. So join us as we serve up PE, art class, and of course, sex ed. It's school the way it should have been. Cocktails, hot teachers, and the only final is your tab. To support the pod, find out more about the live shows and so much more, head over to patreon.com/HILFpodcast or at HILF Podcast on all social media. And
follow me, follow me, follow me, follow. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow. Follow me, follow me, follow me, follow.
this is in part the key to kind of the next part of our story, which is, Donald Nix is always sitting pretty, but he is not king shit yet. And part of the reason why he gets there is because there's this guy Willoughby who is the closest mouthpiece to the power levers in Washington, and he's part of the reason why, like Blaine said, they're pulling out all these guys, because he's like, don't worry about it. They're not going to invade. The Soviets don't have the appetite for it. They don't want it. And in part, some of the people on the Soviet side were saying, if we attack, they're not going to do shit. Look at them. This is kind of a perfect time to attack, because they're not only are they not expecting it, it doesn't look like they give a good goddamn. They just might not put their best foot forward to try to get South Korea back. And Donald Nichols, with his unique position to see what was up, was like, bitch, they coming. Girl, bitch, they coming. And not only is the North Koreans coming, girl, I'm going to go ahead and say sometime between mid-June and like late June, maybe early July. And so when the North Koreans officially start what we now call the Korean War by invading the South, Donald Nichols' star rises, because it becomes abundantly clear this guy Willoughby didn't know shit, and whatever he was doing to stop Nichols' intelligence from getting is now in a thing. And war's on, so Nichols gets even more resources and even more sort of power, because we got to win this shit. Also, your intelligence was correct.
Right.
It wasn't just that you had different intelligence; you had the correct one.
Right. Charles Willoughby was the chief of intelligence working for Douglas MacArthur. People in Washington said, who is Donald Nichols, and does he know what he's talking about? And so they asked Willoughby, and Willoughby said he doesn't know what he's talking about, because Willoughby had sent a report to Washington at about the same time saying an invasion is unlikely.
Yeah. It's such a internal drama. I mean, you talk about your Game of Thrones stuff, and also I love that didn't he wear a monocle too?
He did.
I think this is important as we try to picture Willoughby. They accused him of being, was it insufferably Prussian or something?
Bonnie Prince Charlie, they called him. He was insufferable, but he wasn't stupid. And so when he heard that this master sergeant, low of the low, was contradicting him, and that people in Washington wanted to know who was correct, Willoughby tried to have Nichols fired and thrown off the Korean peninsula.
Sure, you're like, who's correct? This motherless 23-year-old? Look at me, I'm wearing a monocle. It's obviously me.
Right.
That's correct.
Right. And Nichols survived that because he was working for the U.S. ambassador in South Korea and not for Willoughby at the time. So he lucked out. He wasn't thrown out. Then the invasion happened. And the invasion was a total and utter disaster for the United States. For the first couple months of the war, the Americans retreated, were killed, surrendered, they panicked, and they ended up on the southern toe of the Korean Peninsula. And Nichols, during that time, because he had warned that the war was coming, because he was well-sourced, he was the only person who could give the Air Force bombing targets, because bombing was all they could do until they sent in, hundreds of thousands of troops to fight the war. And Nichols told them...
But they're on their way.
Right.
We don't got them yet.
Nichols told them where to bomb, and all of a sudden, he was the man. He spoke Korean. He had sources in the North. He knew everybody in the South, in the intelligence services of the South Korean government, and throughout the army. He was, bulletproof. And in that summer of 1950, after the invasion happened in June, Nichols... he had some intelligence coups, but he was also promoted. Within a year, he went from master sergeant to lieutenant to captain to major. A trajectory of a promotion that is basically unprecedented in that war.
And if I'm right, some of those promotions were made to just match the audacity that he had. I mean, there were times like he wouldn't wear his uniform, wouldn't salute someone, wouldn't follow a chain of command. And when they'd come in there and be like, why the fuck can this guy do this? They'd be like, oh, well, you know what? He can't. But if he's a lieutenant, he can. So we'll just make him a lieutenant. Right. I mean, it was batshit.
That's right. And one of the things that he managed to do, he was brilliant at this. He would find an older officer and he would find a way to please him. And the older officer that he found was the Air Force General Partridge, who was the head of the Air Force for that part of the world. And he and Partridge met, and Partridge realized that Nichols was the best intelligence informant on the Korean Peninsula. And so he made this special deal with him. He said, all right, you don't have to report to anybody but me. So he didn't have to go through a chain of command, and he didn't have anybody telling him how, when, or what to do. He did it himself, and he was given his own base. He says he was given his own rules, including a license to murder. Which it appears he did. Right.
I mean, of the bullshit that he spouts, that seems to be one of them things that is absolutely right.
And Syngman Rhee gave him several hundred South Korean Air Force officers, some of whom were highly skilled, and then he eventually got about 50 or 60 American Air Force intelligence people working for him. So he had his own base.
Which is so cool, and it's so key, like, too, to remember that, like, this is an Air Force that is actually separate from the U.S. Air Force. Like, he actually has his own
right
Air Force that he commands. And this is the part too, just for context. So the beginning, after the North invades, the South loses fast, and the U.S., and we are literally holding on like edge of a cliff, very tiny little bit of ground at the South. Once the U.S. truly flexes, puts all of its best and worst instincts into just winning. How do we win? There is this, if you watch sort of a time lapse of the map of, it looks like a wave kind of crashing and receding to the point where we get all the way up to almost the Russian border, and then they come back. And this 38th parallel just kind of keeps going back and forth. And part of the quote unquote victories, the wins, the accomplishments that the South Koreans and the US have is so utterly devastating, not only to the South Koreans, but to North Korea. There is a reason why the Kim dynasty has such an easy time telling the people about the evil, rotten Americans and how scared they should be of what America can do to them. And I'm hoping you can give us some of those stats on the extent of the damage to both bodies and structures that, once the tide of the war is changed in the U.S.'s favor, start to to unfold there.
So what happens as the war begins, the Americans on the ground, the military, the infantry, the army, they are helpless. They don't have good armor, they don't have artillery, and they have ill-trained, unfit soldiers who retreat, run away, surrender, panic. That's the situation on the ground for the first 2-3 months of the war. Reinforcement starts to come, but the first thing that comes for the Americans is air power. They had lots of pilots from World War II. They had lots of bombers. They had unlimited amounts of bombs left over, and they had napalm. And so what they needed was targets to drop all this ordnance on. And the person who had the targets was Nichols and his team of spotters and spies who were moving around in North Korea looking for places to drop bombs on. Nichols became the single most important source of information on where the bombs were dropped. And this is the scale of the bombing. In the first year and a half of the war, the American Air Force bombed every city, town, and village in North Korea, flattened virtually every habitable dwelling. This is according to assessments by the Americans and the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, and you know it's bad when MacArthur was like, yikes.
And then,
even MacArthur was like, yikes, guys, this seems like a lot.
And part of that was because that was what was possible to do. And then after the Chinese got involved in the war, they invaded in 1951. The Americans got really pissed. And then they did a fire job on all the cities, towns, and villages that they had previously turned into rubble. And this was a bombing campaign that was often understood by people outside of the United States as genocide.
Absolutely. And it's also like, it wasn't just the Koreans, North and South. Like, a lot of American GIs were going into this meat grinder too. Like, the bombers were doing their thing. They weren't, I wouldn't say they were safe, but there was a ground war too that was as bad and as deadly and as terrifying as trench warfare in World War I. And there are over 8,000 still missing in action. I mean, it's gobsmacking. There's a reason why we didn't want to look at it, you know?
In the first year of the war, about 33,000 GIs were killed. So the number is huge, but also the rapidity of the death. It happened so quickly as the Americans struggled to figure out how to fight this war, and it was very confusing to the GIs who were there because they didn't really understand why they were there, what they were doing. It was quite possible to arrive, go out and get killed in a couple days for a war you didn't understand. The war quickly became quite unpopular, and after it was over, it was called the Forgotten War. But from Nichols' point of view, it was a great war. It was a wonderful war because it allowed him to use his language skills, his spying expertise, all his contacts to make himself into a very big deal. In Korea, during the war and after the war, there were 3 intelligence operations. Army intelligence, which was not that good because of Willoughby, the guy who worked for MacArthur. The CIA, which was a nascent organization that was really, really struggling to do a good job and to figure out what was going on. And there was Nick, his organization named after him. Nick was virtually unknown outside of the intelligence community. But both the CIA and Army intelligence tried to hire Nick away, but the Air Force wouldn't allow it because he was so productive for them, and because Partridge stayed in that arena for many years and kept this special relationship with an intelligence guy that he described as impossibly skilled, the most valuable man. He called him my one-man war.
Oh, God, and Nichols was not unaware of the kind of power he had. And there were some really remarkable ways that you talk about just to sort of highlight what he was able to do that like nobody else would have been able to do, that it would have been unmissable for him to know how valuable he was. And one of my favorites is when when Lieutenant Murray comes into South Korea, and this guy is a Navy code breaker. He's the guy from the Navy, and he's like, okay, so we got this guy, and he gets all this, he knows everything. So obviously, I need to get to the guy that knows everything, and we're both on the same team here. And Nichols doesn't share shit. He doesn't give him information. He doesn't give him sources. And this Murray is like, who the fuck are you? And this should never happen. This can never happen. But I guess if I have to write a letter to tell somebody it's happening, then that'll be all I have to do to make it go away. And so Lieutenant Murray goes and is like, this is fucking guy who will not help me help you. So why don't you tell him to help me help you? And they were like, why don't you go fuck yourself? He can do whatever he wants. Yeah. And it was like, what?
Nichols had
to another American? Oh my God.
Nichols had established himself as the code break king. He had found a North Korean cryptographer before the war who defected from...
Was this Cho?
Yes. And so this guy defected. Nichols found him and said, okay, let's start a cryptography outfit inside the South Korean Air Force, which Nichols helped create. He told Sigmund Rhee to create an Air Force, and then he created this unit inside the Air Force that Cho headed for cryptography. After the war started, Cho fled down south where the Americans were hanging on to the toehold at the bottom of the Korean peninsula. Nichols found him. And Cho, what he had as a defector, he had the code books for the North Korean army. And they set up a listening point, and they actually turned out to have perfect transparent intelligence on all the maneuvers that the North Koreans were doing to try to take the rest of the peninsula. They gave that information to Nichols. Nichols says, I found this. And then he gives this to the commanders of the Air Force and of the Army, and then they start to fight very effectively against the North Koreans because they had perfect intelligence in real time, thanks to Cho and thanks to Nichols. So Nichols had this code break operation going, and then this guy Murray came in from outside of Korea to try to take over, and Nichols said, "Thank you very much. I'll take all your cryptography equipment, all your radios, and I want you to get the hell off the Korean peninsula." And
that's right. I forgot he also took all his stuff.
And so he chased him off. And
I love it.
And this was analyzed much, much later by American intelligence historians, saying nothing like this had ever happened before. And they didn't even in the historical analysis of who Nichols was and what he had done, they got it wrong. They didn't actually know who he was. And this was so 30 years after it happened.
It's so great. I call that like Big Nick energy.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it wasn't just like to these higher ups. There's a lot of accounts you talk about recruits who would come into his office, and it was like, this guy was surrounded by dogs. Nick had dogs all around him that would frequently bite people. So like it was part of his self-protection. You mentioned the Coke and the candy bars, that he was a compulsive eater, and he would just drown himself and like throw up and then keep eating more. Like there was a definite ism going on with how much he consumed. He had a number of houseboys that would live with him and come and go. I think the most explicit you say is that they took turns jerking him off, but that was just the one that they talked about, or the one that there's like an account of. I mean, he would take people and order them to parachute into North Korea as punishment. Like a lot of the folks that he sent out to do actual legitimate spying, like, I want to find out where that hydraulic dam is, or I want you to go back to a town that you're from and talk to the people who used to know you, and then get a job working in a place, and then come back and tell us how it worked. And like almost half of the people he sent out would die. But then he would also, just as a punishment, throw people out of airplanes and send them into places where it's when you say it was like that Apocalypse Now, I mean, it really feels vividly maniacal and cruel.
Well, there was no one supervising him. So he sort of did what he wanted, And he wrote an autobiography years later. And in that autobiography, he said, what do you do when you have a license to murder? And he acknowledged that he misused it. One of the things that shows just how unsupervised he was is that in 1951, at really the peak of his powers of sending people to North Korea who would never come back, is that the people who worked in his base and who were training for these missions, they started to panic because they realized that they were on suicide missions. So 5 of them broke into Nick's residence one night on his base with guns, and there was a shootout in his residence. He shot 3 of those people to death, and two were then arrested and court-martialed. And this is an extraordinary event in a military compound, but there wasn't a word of it in his military service record. So officially, it never happened, although I did talk to 3 people who were there.
Oh, my God.
And who said it did happen. And
because it is exactly the kind of thing he would make up,
It was just
right?
the sort of thing that Nick would do.
Yeah. Oh, my God. I love that. And it really brings us to, because, so we've seen him now at his peak. We followed him from this, early 20s. He learned some Korean. He made a very convenient friendship. He's proven right at a most critical time. He gets all this power. The war lasts from 1950, almost exactly 3 years, to 1953. And it's an armistice. So I can't really say the war ended. It was just sort of okay, so now we're back to the 38th parallel, give or take, and we're all promising to be on our best behavior. And for a lot of the soldiers, we're probably like, oh my God, fuck, Jesus, thank God, right? Except for Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee and Don Nichols were probably the 3 people that were like, shit, the war's over. Shit. Now what do we do?
It's true. For Nichols, there was a loss of funding, a loss of manpower. He was sent back briefly to the United States, but his good friend General Partridge got him sent back. And so he stayed on. The war ended in 1953, but Nichols was there for another 5 years.
Which is even weirder. Like, that whole 11 years is bizarre, but like nothing is more bizarre than the last 5. Why are you still there?
The reason he was still there was because of his relationship with Syngman Rhee. Syngman Rhee was president throughout that whole time, and still killing his enemies. And Nichols worked with the henchmen for Syngman Rhee, who were killing his enemies and generally trying to control, in an anti-democratic way, an emerging democratic society, which South Korea has become, by the way. I think one thing we should do is give the credit to the United States for creating in South Korea probably the most successful democratic capitalistic country on earth. I mean, there are 50 million South Koreans, and it's the 11th largest economy in the world. It's not a perfect place. It's a high-pressure capitalist democracy with lots of problems, but it is a democracy with real wealth and incredibly creative, energetic people. And the United States...
And probably in large part because they had to fight so hard to get our asses out of there. And like, spoiler alert, Syngman Rhee, he doesn't have a great time of it, and ultimately the CIA has to like sneak his ass out of the country before the people rise up and take him out. And so it was like
South Korea did not come to democracy for another 20 years or so after the war. But the United States did in the long run play a useful role in South Korea. And it sort of stands out. I used to cover Africa for the Washington Post. And whenever the Americans got really involved, things often turned out very badly. But South Korea is a great exception to that.
Tell us about when Partridge has moved out and he no longer enjoys the comfort of his protection. I thought this was stunning. From Don Nichols' first negative report to to being dragged out of South Korea in a straitjacket. If you can walk us through that series of events,
right.
please.
So this is 1957. Nichols has been there for 11 years, and his military service record is full of the most effusive praise imaginable. People describe him as the most important intelligence operative in East Asia, as a one-man war, as the essential spy for the Air Force. And that is included in every report up until the summer of 1957, when, for pretty vague reasons, and pretty stupid reasons, really, Nichols gets a negative evaluation. They say he doesn't wear the right uniform, he's gotten fat, he's somewhat abrasive with his subordinates, his dogs bite people.
Yeah, and he's like,
all those things have been his modus operandi for 11 years, and so suddenly
you didn't mind before,
and so they decided that he should not continue in command, and that he should be removed from his base. And he tried to get this overruled, but he didn't. And what I think happened, based on the evidence and from countless interviews with people who understand the way the Air Force works, is that Nichols was doing things that were clearly illegal and intolerable, but they didn't want to put it in his service report. There are three things that sort of stand out. One is Nichols was making himself rich. He had an office with filing cabinets full of dollars and Korean won and other currencies. And there was no control over how he used that money. And he'd been trading in the black market to multiply the value of his dollars for years. Some of the people who served with him said that he sold military equipment for dollars. In any case, when he came back to the United States, he had several $100,000 in cash, which he kept in his brother's freezer. So the Air Force probably became aware that he was a big-time crook in terms of dealing with money. Secondly, his involvement with Syngman Rhee was getting darker and darker. One of Syngman Rhee's political opponents was summarily hanged after a completely phony trial. Nichols was implicated in that guy's arrest and downfall. And then the third thing is the sex thing. The Air Force had a specific policy against homosexuality.
Throw people out of planes if you must.
Yeah,
but no butt stuff.
But no blowjobs in your office. And
Not from a man anyway. Come on.
Right. And I talked to South Korean Air Force officers who served with Nichols, who brought him young men regularly who gave Nichols blowjobs in his office. And he would masturbate these young men. And this happened for years. And it was generally known by a whole coterie of South Koreans, and Americans and the CIA and Army intelligence must have all been aware of this. So those are three pretty big reasons for losing your job in the American military. One of the historians who studied Nichols said that, he was the kind of person that you use in wartime, but once the war's over, you got to get rid of him. And so in 1957, in the middle of the night, Air Force intelligence people came for Nichols, put him in a straitjacket, and flew him to a hospital in Japan and put him in the psych ward and pumped him full of Thorazine.
Yeah, and I love you saying the thing too. You're like, and the staff who was used to collecting what was casualties of the war were like, I'm sorry, we really, even in the official record, which I found crazy, you know what I mean? Because there's got to be a lot of fuckery going on in terms of official records. That it even includes the staff being like, he doesn't seem crazy. We're also looking through his files and there's no report, he doesn't have any history of this. And they were like, if you give him enough Thorazine though, he's going to seem as crazy as you need him to be to get to our next phase.
The official diagnosis was schizophrenia. And none of the symptoms of schizophrenia were in Donald Nichols' behavior. He simply wasn't a schizophrenic. And I talked to lots of psychiatrists who reviewed his medical records and said there's no evidence at all that he was a schizophrenic. But they had to have some diagnosis, and so that's what they gave him. And then they gave him really large doses of Thorazine, and he became really angry. He had been the boss of everything, with no control other than his friendly relationship with General Partridge. And then all of a sudden, he was in a psych ward and told that he was mentally ill.
And they would be like, he is lashing out.
Yeah.
And they'd be like, he is throwing chairs. And I'm like, bitch, I would throw more than a chair, and I have had none of the power of Donald Nichols.
Yeah, so he was screwed. And it took him a while to realize it. So he became increasingly agitated in this hospital in Japan. And so they put him on another plane and flew him to Eglin Air Force Base on the Florida Panhandle, put him in a psych ward.
Where he won't seem as weird.
Right.
Because once you're in Florida, everything kind of levels up.
And then they pumped him full of really large doses of Thorazine. And then when he was unresponsive and angry and seething, then they started electroshock therapy. He had 14 consecutive days of electric shock therapy, which is quite unusual.
And can you describe, too, when you're going, I mean, for those of us who haven't seen One Flew Over a Cuckoo's Nest lately, like the pretty draconian process that is receiving electroshock in 1957?
Right. So you've got this guy who's in his mid-30s now, early 30s, mid-30s, who's really angry, is realized that he's trapped. He can't get out. And so every day they come to him, rub Vaseline on his temples, stick a rubber plug in his mouth, and then use these 2 electrodes on the side of his head to give him electroshock for between 20 seconds and a couple of minutes. And then they go away. He endured this treatment, and when the treatment would stop for a while, he would write letters to General Partridge saying, get me out of here.
I could use a job.
What can I do? What should I do? And as the treatments went on, his behavior became more passive. And he said that he was in deep trouble mentally. And he knew that he was going to be pushed out of the Air Force. And he wondered what he should do. And General Partridge was sympathetic, but, he really couldn't do much for the guy either. Nichols was allowed to go see his family, and some of his brothers lived in Florida at the time. And when he went home on these leaves from the psychiatric hospital, he said they're trying to wipe my brain because I know too much about what happened in Korea.
Yeah. I had to say, one of the most shocking things about this part for me in your book is twofold. That he was able to write these letters and then visit his family sort of in the midst of this treatment is sort of evidence that it was disorienting him, that it had made him more passive and malleable. But then when he says, I think they're trying to erase my brain, and you as a reader are like, yeah, I mean, I have a hunch that probably was. But then your book says, maybe they were, but this was standard treatment. Like 14 days in a row is maybe on the outside, and 1,200 milligrams of Thorazine is maybe on the outside. But that at the time, this wasn't that unusual as a method of treating someone with this condition.
In the 1950s, electroshock was given to a very, very large number of GIs who came back who complained about shell shock.
Because it wasn't a great time,
right.
Man. And not to mention his childhood that we talked about. I mean, they did such, fuck Don Nichols. I'm not trying to be an apologist, but they definitely didn't do a service to this guy.
No.
If they were trying to treat something.
No. What they did is they treated a schizophrenic who didn't exist, and they ignored the sexual predator who was right in front of them and who probably would have talked about it had they asked him the right questions. And he wasn't there for medical treatment. He was there to be gotten rid of, to become a non-person, which he became.
So this Don Nichols, who in his clearest mind is a danger to the world, they treat him with this electroshock, and then they send him out into the world. Good luck, champ. And that is kind of where I thought, man, when you got to that part of the story, so he goes through electroshock and he goes to Thorsey and he's discharged and he has his disability and he goes to live with his brother. I'm thinking, so this is going to be kind of Clockwork Orange kind of deal. And it's going to be like, oh, that's an interesting story, man. And I don't know, like, I don't know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. And it's very complex. And I feel suddenly some kind of sad sympathy for this guy. But this ain't done. Ladies and gentlemen, okay? Once Donald Nichols is discharged and very fat and his brain is broken and he's living with his brother, can you tell us the circumstances under which our 3 young men arrive from South Korea, who these young men are, and the way in which Don Nichols introduces them to his brother's family where he's living?
When Nichols was in South Korea, he had houseboys who worked for him. A lot of officers did, and he had a pretty big office, and he lived right there. So he needed a houseboy, and so he had 2. And they came back to the United States around the time that Nichols was flown to Eglin Air Force Base. And they actually arrived right after he went to live with his brother Judson in South Florida. His other son, in parentheses, son in quotation marks, had been sent back earlier. And when that son, whose name was Donnie, was sent back, Nichols said that he was an adopted kid. This becomes an interesting story because about 15 years later, Nichols says that Donnie is his natural son from a wife that he had in South Korea.
I mean, she's
an invented wife. But so at this time, when Don goes to live with his brother Judson, he has 3 young Korean boys with him, and it's a small house with no money, and they don't get along very well at all. And Nichols' behavior is bizarre in the extreme. He arrives at the house in a brand new car, a big long Chevy that he just bought. He has shocking amounts of cash. And he flashes it around all the time. The kids in that family could not believe that anybody would have that much money. But he bought lots of candy bars and Coke, but he didn't like to give it to anybody but himself. So they didn't get along very well. And after a few months, he moved out and he bought a house for cash in Fort Lauderdale, a suburb of Fort Lauderdale, where he lived for about 5 or 6 years. And he didn't get along very well with his 2 oldest adopted sons, who were in their mid-teens and a little bit older by that time. But he did get along well with Donnie, who was 12, 13 at the time. So during this time, he settled into a kind of suburban life and did some lawn work, had his disability pension, and then he started abusing boys in the neighborhood, the 12, 13-year-old sons of his neighbors. And finally, one of the boys told his father that Donald Nichols had given him a blowjob and that he didn't know what to do. And so the boy, Nichols, was arrested, and he started to panic. He'd gotten away with his behavior, his strange life, throughout his life without any problems. But all of a sudden he was facing a trial that could put him in prison for 5 years or longer. So he sold his house, he sold 2 other properties. He did it all in one day, and took the cash, several $100,000, got in his car with Donnie, and took off.
Can you tell us about the $25,000 cash that he accidentally leaves in a diner and how that factors into our story?
So Nichols is traveling with lots of cash. He puts like $30,000-$40,000 into a bank in Los Angeles that he wanted to draw on later. But he also has a paper bag with $25,000 in cash, and that's a lot of money in the 1960s. Yeah. Wow. So he goes in, has dinner, and then the waitress calls the police, and the police say, "Why are you traveling with a a paper bag with $25,000 in it and heading to Mexico.
With this kid.
Right. And then they do some research and they realize that he is wanted for sex crimes in Florida. And so Nichols gets a lawyer, gets out on bail, somehow gets his $25,000 and his car and his son Donnie, and then skips bail and goes to Mexico for a couple of years.
My God. And the U.S. government at this point is like, oh, boy, this could really start to look bad for us. And don't they get his brother, his sweet, I don't know why in my brain I've painted Don's brothers as these sort of sweethearts, but the CIA and the FBI are like, we could really use your help. Getting old Donnie to help. Come on home.
The FBI goes and talks to Judson, the brother, and says, we might be able to put you in jail unless you can help bring your brother home. So Judson goes to Mexico, talks to his brother, and persuades him to come back. And Donald Nichols' life in Mexico had been pretty good in the sense he went down there with lots of money. He made some friends. His son enrolled in school. Donald Nichols lost about 100 pounds in weight, and in photographs, he's unrecognizable.
That's right, on the watermelon diet, right? Doesn't he eats exclusively watermelons or something?
It was one of many diets.
So bizarre, so fucking.
So he persuades. His brother persuades Don Nichols, Nick, to come back to the United States, and he's arrested at the border, taken back to Fort Lauderdale, and he hires one of the best trial lawyers in Florida. And the lawyer does a great job. He keeps the trial out of the newspapers. No one writes about the trial, and because there had been some contradictions in the testimony of the parents and the boys, Nichols was acquitted. And the severity of the charges were unknown. In my reporting, probably the most hair-raising moment was when I went into the courthouse in Fort Lauderdale, and this was about 7 years ago, and I asked for the records on Don Nichols, and there was a young guy there, and he said, "I can't give you the records because they're classified. They're personal records of a sexual trial." And I said, "You could give them to me. Just give them to me. They're old. Nobody cares."
Go ahead.
And so he did. He gave
that worked.
He gave me
what a Don Nichols thing to do, Blaine.
He gave me the entire file, and so I'm sitting there reading the file, and the file is the affidavits of the boys describing what Nichols had done to them. And it was so cruel. And so it just broke my heart. And so I read it with this incredible excitement as a reporter, as a historian, but also with the broken heart. No one in Nichols' family knew about this, what these charges amounted to. But Nichols was acquitted of those charges and then moves again away from Fort Lauderdale up to a sort of a small town called Brooksville, Florida, in Central Florida, sort of in the middle of a pretty poor conservative area where the Klan is pretty strong, and then he lives there for the next 15, 20 years.
Well, see, and now that was the part of your story. I'm like, oh, I get it. This is going to be more like the end of Goodfellas, where I know there's good guys and bad guys and morality is split, and I kind of hate my flawed hero, but then I watch him sort of wave at me in the end credits, and I got away with it. But no, right? Because he doesn't. Tell us. It's so spectacular, and especially I love that you gave us the reminder that he's a real bastard. He's cool and fascinating from a certain perspective because he's so batshit and so audacious, and he comes at such a crossroads of history. But he does get his.
Yeah.
Right? Can you tell us about some of that?
Well, what happened when he went to Brooksville, he still had some cash. He brought some real estate. He had a chicken farm. He had several properties, a gas station, and he raised his son Donnie, who started to, and I think he gave the service station to him. His son married, had a couple kids, and Don Nichols actually became part of the school board. Served on committees in the school board, and was well known. He joined the Mormon Church. He had a measure of respectability. It was really the only normal phase of his life. But during most of those years, he was continuing to find young boys to abuse. And finally, in 1987, so the chickens came home to roost, so to speak, is that he was charged with molesting young boys again. And this time, the local press went after him. They disclosed that he was a former intelligence guy from Korea, and what had happened just 2 weeks before his arrest, the St. Petersburg paper had written a really glowing piece about who he was and what he had done in Korea. To some extent, they didn't really know the details, but it was the best publicity he'd ever had in his life. And then 2 weeks later, he was arrested. And so the reporters at the St. Petersburg paper, was a very good newspaper, they said, well, we got to find out more. And so they interviewed him. They found out that there were other cases besides the original charge. And so Nichols was finally caught up in the law for child abuse in a way that he couldn't really escape it. So he pleaded no contender to the charges, and was put in a psychiatric hospital for a while, and then into a military hospital in Tuscaloosa, which he tried to get out of by contacting a friend and setting up some arrangement that would allow him to move back to Florida. But his daughter-in-law didn't want him out, and neither did the prosecutor in Brooksville. And so Nichols was in Tuscaloosa in the mental hospital all by himself for a number of years, and he died there in 1992 at age 69.
Which, if there's anything like justice in this story, man. And it's too bad, too, because his son that he said was adopted and then says was biological, Donnie had tragically died in a boat accident. Right. A couple years before this, I think you say in 1985, which left Donnie's wife, who was probably privy or at least suspicious of the fact that old Don Nichols is not a good dude. And so when it came to her to be the executor, she was like, fuck him, leave him. Well, he's not coming home to me and my kids, I'll tell you that much, right?
I think that's what she thought. She declined to talk to me. I did talk to his granddaughter, though, and her memories of Don Nichols were, not bad. As he had been an affectionate grandfather to her, but his daughter-in-law, I believe the reason she didn't talk to me is because she had a very bitter experience with him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which makes sense.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I have no doubt.
Yeah.
And what a disservice too. As you describe the way that the FBI, CIA gets his brother to bring him back from Mexico, then for him to be acquitted. I mean, it's such an injustice to the future victims that he was permitted to permeate and have access to all of these victims when the evidence of what he did was covered. It was obscured, but it was there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, he managed to leave Fort Lauderdale with no criminal record and no dark splotches on his history, and was served on a school board in Brooksville. But I think the sort of the final note of Nichols' death is that he faked his own grave.
Yes, Yes, tell us all about
His
it.
grave marker shows that he's buried beside Kim Hwa, a woman that he said that he married in Korea during the Korean War. And I spoke almost every day for a year to the man who was Donald Nichols' key secretary aide. And he said that marriage didn't happen. He wasn't interested in women. He made it up. And so what Nichols did is he brought to the graveyard keeper in Brooksville a box. And he said, the remains of Kim Hwa are in this box. And can you bury them under the stone so that when I die, we'll be together? And they did. And so if you got to the Brooksville Cemetery, you'll see Donald Nichols and Kim Hwa buried together in eternity, even though she doesn't exist. And then the final note of it is that right next to them are grave markers for his parents. His parents, as we talked about it at the beginning, had this really awful marriage where she was sleeping with everybody and their dog all over the East Coast, and the father basically died of a broken heart because he couldn't have her. And the grave marker says that they're there underneath the gravestone. Neither are there. The father was buried in Jersey, and the mother was cremated in South Florida.
It's like his last great con.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, and it also doesn't mention on the gravestone that he served in the military or in Korea.
It's all lies.
Yeah.
He has just lies on his tombstone. I mean,
Right.
we don't even, date of birth is like, we'll have to take his word for it on that.
And nobody attended his funeral, and nobody mentioned how important he was. I mean, his name, as far as I could determine, never appeared in the Washington Post or the New York Times until I wrote my book.
Wow. Well, and it brings us, Blaine, to the fact that you've said, this is not a good guy. You've said he's haunted your dreams, but like your work, your name will be associated with him for as long as anyone is looking at Don Nichols. They're gonna, be talking to some extent with Blaine Harden.
Well, there were a number of military historians who looked at Nichols, but I had this access through the fighter pilot to this military service record, which sort of opened up sort of a rabbit hole that I crawled through. It was good. It was good. In newspaper reporting, historical reporting is luck, very often. So I was lucky with Nichols.
Well, it turned into luck for us. We are so lucky to have had this opportunity to talk with you. And I do want to say thank you again so much for taking the time and for going back into this subject matter just to bring it to us with such freshness and such expertise.
Well, you're welcome. I loved talking about him.
Oh, thanks again to Blaine Harden. You go right now to the show notes and you'll find links not only to this book that we discussed in this episode, but his whole catalog, okay? Because he also wrote, for example, Escape from Camp 14, which is the official biography of another North Korean defector. I mean, seriously, like, you read all three of them books, girl, and you're going to have your BA in modern Korean history, man. Now, up next for us, it's a HILF from the Fuck It Bucket. Ooh, I've invited comedian Alex Malt to join me again. And some of you may remember him from episode 15 about the Salem witch trials. And the twist is this time that he has no idea what we're HILFing until he gets here. I've been going hard on a jaw-dropping story from the American West, and I can't wait for you to find out what it is along with him. Do you have a guess? It's hot as hell. You're gonna love it. Until then, our theme song was composed and performed by Kat Perkins, and all artwork for HILF is designed by the incredible Joe Dressel. A reminder that you can find my sources, links to the books, documentaries, and articles I reference in the summary of this episode, or by emailing us hilfpodcast@gmail.com or messaging us on social media @hilfpodcast. This has been HILF, History I'd Like to Fuck with Don Brody, reminding you that history is a party and everybody's coming. I think if there's any comfort to be drawn, it's that at least today we have clear-eyed leadership who has everyone's best interest at heart, and nothing like this could ever happen again.